What I describe trauma is any experience of overwhelm where that overwhelm has been that what we've experienced has been too much, too soon, or for too long, when we haven't had the safety, support or resources to be with what is overwhelming.
We certainly know that children who grow up in domestic violence relationships or experience sexual assault or neglect are quite likely to have a range of behavioural issues in adulthood. Everything from drug and alcohol abuse to kill the pain of what's occurred, quite often will have mental health impacts and may have poor relationships with others. What that might mean is that they might use violence in their relationships, or alternatively they might be quite vulnerable to those who use violence, so they might end up in violent relationships themselves.
His mother died when he was very, very little. He was kind of often told, you can't expect your stepmother to mother you because your mother's dead, you don't have a mother, and you can't expect that from... So there were kind of two kids there being kind of parented by a mum and a dad, and then for him, he was kind of on the outside and not being given that nurturance. My guess would be that he had a very wounded and unparented inner child in there that made him feel very dependent and powerless and at the mercy of anyone that was close to him, and probably had a lot of rage and grief that was a bit overwhelming and he didn't know how to deal with. So he was kind of coming from a position of not really... didn't have many coping skills to deal with those overwhelming feelings, and he didn't want to feel them, and so he had to control anything that might, in his environment, that might bring him in contact with any of those feelings, which of course is going to be primarily the person that you're most intimate with.
So trauma has a range of impacts on a person, so it might result in depression, sleeplessness, anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, ideas that the world's not safe, ideas that they're not valuable people in the world, that they are stupid and useless because they've been told that over a long period of time. And what this is about the impact of fear. When we experience fear in situations that are completely outside of our control and our ability to understand. And it's a long road to recovery from that. And during that period of time, people may appear to others to be, a little bit off, a little bit loopy, a little bit off their tree. And yeah, they probably are. But that's not because there's anything wrong with them. It's because of what's happening to them. So their ideas and thoughts and ways they do things might be a bit different. They will also be living in a heightened state of fear. The world is not a safe place. Terrible things happen. Terrible things can happen to me at any time. And what that means is that even the slightest of things that occur can be met with great emotional outpouring and distress, because what that's doing is pushing them over the barrier of normal human control all of the time.
It seems that a lot of kids don't really mature properly emotionally after they've been abused, that they stay emotionally children. And
Absolutely.
Like the impact on our community is...
And that's if you've experienced fear for most of your childhood time, as well as your intellectual capacity being impacted, your emotional capacity will also be considerably reduced. And sometimes we see, particularly where the child has also experienced sexual assault as part of that behaviours, we will see a stagnation in their emotional development. So you might work with women who, are in their 30s and 40s and have still got pretty pink ribbons in their hair, or are talking in ways and with concepts that are quite childish. Or we might see men who are really not controlling their emotions at all and behaving in ways that are reactive that you might expect of a 12-year-old.
I saw him do this. I saw him do this with not just with me, but with other people in his world, where he felt very entitled to judge and attack other people for being who they were, or behaving in ways that to me seemed fairly normal and human, but obviously triggered something in this guy that he didn't want to be exposed to in them or in himself. So there's an emotional level to it, but there's also that sort of, I think some people might have had those feelings but would have stopped short of actually attacking people.
The pain from feeling rejected and emotionally unattended to, after a little while in a child's brain, actually gets numbed. So the real dilemma there is once the pain of rejection is numbed, the child has no motivation to seek comfort. And that's actually the neurobiological process under I start to block care. And of course no parents understand this, so a lot of parents start to become a bit more harder with their kids when they're sort of doing that, instead of, in actual fact, becoming softer and more emotionally attuned or connected. So the guy's sort of really not seeking comfort from his wife and really shut down and gets annoyed with her because she asked him how he's feeling, all that sort of stuff. So we sort of identify the style, and I'm really curious, like what was it like when you were a kid, and how did you start to behave, because you couldn't trust that Dad would be okay if you said anything. Well, and all of a sudden we start to identify, we call this connecting the dots, how this person really started to creatively adapt into that environment, into this style, started to pull back. Wasn't safe to come forward. Actually, it lost motivation to come and seek comfort. Wow, well, that makes total sense, Like, brilliant, actually. Like, you're actually, like, you're not in a psych unit. You're running a reasonably okay life, You've got problems in the relationship, but that same style ain't working well for you now. And that's the dilemma. It was brilliant at the beginning, but what serves us well as a child in the world doesn't work so well for us as an adult in the world. So we change the narrative, we clean up that narrative. Well, I'm not a dropkick after all. I wasn't a bad kid. God, I was a really scared kid. Oh, well, that's incredible. So I'm changing my narrative, and from Siegel's studies and research, the brain starts to become more integrated. So certain parts start lighting up, and yeah.
So it's becoming conscious of the cause that produces the effect.
And yes, and the depathologizing when we do it that way. So you're not a bad bastard. You're not a psycho. You're not a sick unit. Like what you're doing is absolutely not okay. But that's your behaviour. The person is basically good, worthwhile, and intelligent. And that's it.
I'm not saying that trauma begets trauma, because I think if you've been traumatised, you don't want to traumatise someone else. But when you haven't done any work on it, when you haven't taken that dark night of the soul and really looked at your truth and really felt your vulnerability and acknowledged it and, cried and done the work that you need to do, which is ongoing, if you don't do that and you isolate, it will turn into a shadow, and it will act itself out in a potentially abusive way, and that's very sad.
There's so many people in trauma, and we're all acting as if everything's normal and good. And I feel like if we can have a society that recognises there's so much trauma and abuse going on so many levels in our society, and if we stop making it, that's something that is stigmatising, and recognise that actually is normal in our society, doesn't mean it's appropriate or okay, but I believe it's become normal. It's normalised and laughed off a lot of the time. And if we can recognise that this is an epidemic across families everywhere, then we can make a difference. We're lost on many fronts, and it is really disturbing to see what's happening. It's just so much nasty unconsciousness and lack of empathy for each other and each other's realities. I also do know there's pockets where there's amazing supports and connections, very rich communities that sponsor and support and teach and encourage and build that safety and community that is so healing.
I am someone that can identify with getting very quickly angry, and that is something that I really have to work on with self-regulation. But yeah, and again, also anger can be contagious, because if you're if you're around somebody that's, I don't know, road raging, for example, you know, yes, of course, the normal thing, or not the normal, but the sensible thing to do would be able to sort of take a breath and go, okay, I'm not going to react. But immediately there's a fight, you're going to be in fight or flight. You're going to get defensive and maybe react, and then, you know, which is dangerous these days in London because of what potentially can happen. So, yeah, it's really important to try to control that.
I like that contagion idea. That is sort of, I hadn't really got that before.
Yeah. And I think if you think about, you know, you were saying you hadn't really realised, you didn't really know about self-soothing, and I would assert that NA meetings and fellowship meetings were self-soothing, actually, because, you know, you're suddenly sitting in a room with a bunch of people, and everybody's brains and beings have one very common intention together, which is to stay safe and not use, and that has a sort of energetic that is regulating. It could be completely mad and lots of stuff being said and acting out, talking a bit, but there's a holding in the collective of everybody's brains together. I mean,
So I suggest for people, if they are feeling like they are lost or disheartened by the way their community, family or friends are, is to look, because you will find a community that can be with the naming of the truth without being airy-fairy, without being positive thinking or idealistic or in denial, that have resources and supports to be with the whole. And I think when we can find those communities, we can heal. And then there's a ripple effect, because when one person heals, they engage differently with the people that they're with, and that creates a ripple effect, and it just keeps going on. So, but we need to have the skills and tools to be able to be with the uncomfortable, and that, I think, is one of the major blockers to why we're not getting past domestic violence, because people generally don't have skills to be with whatever's uncomfortable in their life.